The flight to change. Martin Hayes adjusted the lapels of his navy blazer, a perfectly tailored piece that had accompanied him on countless professional endeavors. At 67, Martin exuded a timeless grace, his silver hair neatly combed, and his eyes carrying a spark of quiet wisdom. He was embarking on a well-earned vacation, a break after decades of dedication to his career. His destination, New York City, where he planned to explore art galleries, enjoy fine dining, and soak in the city's vibrant culture. Arriving at Los Angeles International Airport early, as was his habit, Martin made his way to the first-class lounge. The space buzzed with travelers sipping coffee, reading newspapers, and conducting business on laptops. Martin, a seasoned traveler, appreciated the calm before the storm of boarding. Settling into a plush chair, he opened his tablet to scan the morning headlines. It was his ritual, a quiet moment to reflect and prepare for the day. Martin had lived a life defined by precision and planning, qualities that had propelled him from a modest upbringing to the role of CEO at Hayes and Ellington Engineering, a company renowned for revolutionizing airport infrastructure. Retired now, he finally had time to embrace the adventures he'd long postponed. When the gate agent announced boarding, Martin gathered his belongings and approached the gate, his sleek black carry-on rolling effortlessly behind him. The agent, a young woman with a cheerful smile, greeted him warmly. "Have a wonderful flight, Mr. Hayes," she said, scanning his ticket. "Thank you," Martin replied, his voice measured and polite. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, the polished interiors and wide, comfortable seats reminded him of the countless flights he had taken over the years. Selecting his seat by the window, he carefully placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment and sat down. The view outside showed a bustling runway, planes taxiing to and fro under the bright California sun. Martin adjusted his blazer and opened his tablet again. He had barely begun reading when a commotion near the front of the cabin caught his attention. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an airline manager's uniform was speaking in hushed but urgent tones with a flight attendant. His posture was rigid, and his expression was one of unmistakable authority. Martin didn't give it much thought at first, assuming it was standard pre-flight coordination. But then, the manager's voice rose, and his words became clearer. "I'm telling you, he doesn't belong here. Check his ticket again." The accusatory tone turned heads. Passengers exchanged confused glances as the manager strode down the aisle, his gaze sweeping the cabin like a hawk searching for prey. When his eyes landed on Martin, they narrowed. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again," the manager said, his voice clipped and his expression severe. Martin looked up, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Is there a problem?" he asked, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his boarding pass. The manager snatched the pass, his eyes scanning it with skepticism. "First class, huh?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Martin and nearby passengers to hear. "I purchased that ticket weeks ago," Martin replied evenly, his voice betraying no irritation. Several passengers whispered among themselves, the tension in the cabin palpable. A young couple across the aisle exchanged disapproving looks, and a middle-aged woman sitting ahead turned to her husband. "This is ridiculous," she murmured. "Why is he singling that man out?" The manager's scrutiny lingered before he finally handed the ticket back. "It appears to check out," he said reluctantly, his tone begrudging. "But I'll be keeping an eye on you." Martin met his gaze, unflinching. "I would appreciate it if you treated all passengers with respect," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the manager pause. The man said nothing more, retreating to the front of the cabin with a huff. A flight attendant approached Martin moments later, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hayes," she whispered. "He's new and, well, I don't think he meant to." "No need to apologize," Martin interrupted gently. "Let's see how the rest of this flight unfolds." Despite his calm exterior, Martin felt the weight of the incident. Decades of navigating boardrooms and overcoming prejudices had taught him to remain composed. But the blatant scrutiny stirred something deeper, a reminder of battles fought long ago. As the plane's engines roared to life, the murmurs in the cabin subsided, but the tension lingered like an invisible thread, woven through the air. Martin gazed out the window as the aircraft lifted off, climbing into the boundless sky. The sprawling cityscape below soon gave way to endless clouds, and Martin allowed himself a deep breath. He had hoped for a peaceful journey, a quiet interlude before the adventures awaiting him in New York. Instead, he found himself at the center of a storm brewing silently among the passengers, the crew, and within himself. Little did he know, the journey ahead would be far more transformative than any he had planned. The gathering storm. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin crew moved briskly through the aisles, offering refreshments and ensuring passengers were comfortable. Despite their professional demeanor, an undercurrent of unease lingered, a ripple caused by the earlier confrontation between Martin Hayes and the airline manager. Martin sat quietly in his window seat, his posture relaxed, but his mind far from at ease. The faint hum of the engines filled the cabin, masking the low murmurs of nearby passengers. Across the aisle, a young man wearing headphones glanced in Martin's direction, his eyes filled with subtle curiosity and empathy. Others stole quick looks, their expressions ranging from confusion to quiet indignation. The flight attendant returned to Martin's seat, her warm smile a thin veil over her visible discomfort. "Mr. Hayes, can I get you anything to drink?" she asked softly. "A glass of water would be fine," Martin replied, his voice steady and polite. She nodded and hurried away, leaving Martin to his thoughts. The earlier confrontation played on a loop in his mind, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was all too familiar. He had spent years breaking barriers, building his career in an industry where people like him were often underestimated. Despite his achievements, moments like these were a stark reminder that some battles were never truly won. When the flight attendant returned with his water, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I really am sorry about what happened earlier. It's not how we usually treat our passengers." Martin offered a faint smile. "I appreciate your concern. Sometimes people need time to learn." Her cheeks flushed with gratitude before she moved to the next row. The airline manager, however, remained a looming presence. He stood near the galley, arms crossed, his eyes flicking to Martin every so often. His demeanor radiated an air of superiority, as though he were waiting for an opportunity to assert his authority once more. Martin noticed but refused to let it disturb his calm. Instead, he focused on the view outside the window, the clouds forming a serene canvas against the bright blue sky. The world above the earth was a reminder of perspective, how small and fleeting individual struggles could seem in the grander scheme of things. But the peace was short-lived. As the flight attendant handed a glass of champagne to the passenger seated ahead of Martin, the airline manager approached once again. His tone was clipped, and his expression carried a hint of annoyance. "Everything all right here, sir?" he asked Martin, though the question sounded more like a challenge. Martin turned his gaze toward the manager, his face calm but firm. "Everything is fine, thank you. Is there something I can assist you with?" The manager hesitated, his confidence wavering for a fraction of a second. "Just making sure all passengers are where they're supposed to be," he said, his voice dripping with implication. A murmur swept through the cabin. A woman in the row ahead turned in her seat, her irritation plain on her face. "What exactly are you implying?" she asked sharply. "He's clearly supposed to be here." Another passenger chimed in, an older gentleman seated across the aisle. "This is getting out of hand. The man hasn't done anything wrong. Leave him alone." The manager's face reddened, but he doubled down. "I'm just ensuring protocols are followed." Martin raised a hand, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Enough," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "This back and forth serves no purpose. If you have an issue, address it directly. Otherwise, let's allow everyone to enjoy their flight." The cabin fell silent, the weight of Martin's words hanging in the air. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he turned abruptly and walked back toward the galley, his retreat an unspoken admission of defeat. The murmurs resumed, but now they carried a different tone: admiration and support. A young woman seated 2 rows behind Martin leaned forward, her voice low but earnest. "That was incredible. The way you stood up to him. So calm and composed." Martin nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. He had learned long ago that actions often spoke louder than words, and the impact of his composure was already resonating with those around him. Hours passed, and the flight settled into a rhythm. The airline manager kept a low profile, avoiding any further confrontations. Passengers began to relax, though a few continued to glance at Martin, their expressions a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. As the plane began its descent into New York, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Before we do, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special passenger on board today. Mr. Martin Hayes, thank you for flying with us." The cabin erupted in applause, the sound filling the space with warmth and admiration. Martin looked up, his expression one of quiet surprise. He had not expected the recognition but understood the significance. The airline manager, standing near the galley, froze. His face paled as the realization dawned. The murmurs of support earlier had now transformed into full-blown applause, a collective acknowledgement of the man he had so readily dismissed. "Mr. Hayes is not only a valued passenger but a distinguished leader in the engineering industry," the captain continued. "His contributions have improved countless lives, including those of many in this very room. It's an honor to have him aboard." Martin offered a small nod to the passengers around him, his humility evident. Despite the recognition, he remained grounded, his focus on the lessons the day had revealed rather than the accolades. As the plane touched down, a sense of resolution began to take hold. But the journey was far from over, for the passengers, the manager, and even Martin himself. Each had witnessed something greater than a simple conflict in the air. They had seen a lesson in respect, resilience, and the quiet power of standing firm against prejudice. Reflection at 30,000 feet. The plane had landed, but for Martin Hayes and the passengers of Flight 308, the emotional turbulence of the journey was far from over. The applause that had erupted during the captain's announcement still lingered in the minds of everyone on board, a poignant moment that had shifted the mood in the cabin. As passengers began gathering their belongings, the murmurs of conversation took on a new tone, one of curiosity and admiration. That announcement was something else. A woman in her 40s said to her husband, "Did you see the manager's face? He looked like he'd swallowed his tongue." The husband chuckled, nodding. About time someone called him out. The way Mr. Hayes handled that, pure class. Martin remained seated, waiting for the aisle to clear before retrieving his carry-on from the overhead compartment. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't one to bask in the limelight, but he could feel the weight of eyes on him. Passengers who had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a lesson in grace under pressure. As he stood, a young woman approached, clutching a notebook to her chest. She looked to be in her early 20s, her face a mix of nervousness and determination. "Excuse me, Mr. Hayes," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say, thank you. The way you handled that, it meant a lot." Martin smiled warmly, his eyes meeting hers with a kindness that instantly put her at ease. "Thank you for saying so. Sometimes, a calm approach is all it takes to make a point." The woman nodded, her cheeks flushing. "It's more than that. I think a lot of us saw something we needed to see today." Before Martin could respond, the airline manager appeared from the galley. His demeanor had shifted. The arrogance that once defined his posture was replaced with hesitance. He approached slowly, his hands clasped in front of him, like a student called to the principal's office. "Mr. Hayes," the manager began, his voice quieter than anyone had heard it before, "I owe you an apology." The surrounding passengers paused, their attention snapping to the interaction. Martin turned to face him, his expression neutral but attentive. "I made an assumption about you that I had no right to make," the manager continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Martin studied him for a moment, his silence heavy but not unkind. Finally, he nodded. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said. "The important thing is to learn from it." The manager's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded in return. "Thank you. I promise I'll do better." A shift in the terminal. Once the plane reached the gate, passengers began to disembark. Many stopped by Martin's seat on their way out, offering handshakes, words of gratitude, or simply a knowing smile. Martin responded to each gesture with humility, his words measured and genuine. As he stepped into the terminal, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, almost celebratory. A small group of passengers who had witnessed the events of the flight gathered near the gate, recounting the story to others who had been seated further back. "It wasn't just what he said," one man explained animatedly. "It was how he said it. Calm, composed, like he was teaching a masterclass in dignity." Another woman nodded. "And did you hear what the captain said about him? The leader in engineering. No wonder he handled it so well." Martin passed the group with a nod of acknowledgement, but he didn't linger. He was never one for crowds or attention, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But as he moved through the terminal, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found himself face to face with a young boy, no older than 8, holding his mother's hand. The boy looked up at Martin with wide, curious eyes. "Are you famous?" the boy asked innocently. Martin chuckled, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "Not quite," he said, "but I've worked hard to make a difference in the world. That's what matters most." The boy's mother smiled, her eyes full of gratitude. "He's been asking about you ever since the announcement on the plane. I just wanted to say thank you for the example you set." Martin straightened, offering her a polite nod. "If I can inspire him to treat others with respect, then I'd say that's more valuable than anything else." The manager's reflection. Meanwhile, the airline manager stood at the gate, watching Martin interact with passengers. His mind raced with the day's events, replaying every misstep, every misguided word. For the first time, he saw himself through the eyes of those around him. And he didn't like what he saw. Approaching Martin hesitantly, the manager took a deep breath. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I need to say this again, face to face. I'm truly sorry for the way I treated you. It was wrong, and I have no excuse." Martin turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but real change comes from action. What will you do differently moving forward?" The manager hesitated, then nodded firmly. "I'll treat every passenger with the respect they deserve, and I'll make sure my team does the same." Martin extended his hand, and the manager shook it, a gesture that felt as much like a lesson as it did a resolution. "Good," Martin said. "Remember, leadership isn't about power. It's about service." Parting words. As Martin made his way to baggage claim, the events of the day settled into clarity. The confrontation, the applause, the manager's transformation. It all pointed to a simple truth. The power of grace and respect could shift even the most entrenched perspectives. A flight that had begun with tension had ended with hope. And for Martin Hayes, the lesson was as much for himself as it was for everyone else. A city of opportunity. The moment Martin Hayes stepped out of the airport and into the bustling streets of New York City, he felt a shift in energy. The city was alive with motion. Yellow taxis darting through traffic, pedestrians navigating crowded sidewalks, and skyscrapers standing tall against the winter sky. It was a far cry from the tension aboard the flight, but Martin couldn't shake the lingering weight of the day's events. He hailed a cab, his carry-on in tow, and provided the address of his hotel to the driver. As the car wove through the city, Martin allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The confrontation with the airline manager had reminded him of battles he thought he had left behind. Decades of breaking barriers in an industry that often underestimated him had taught him resilience, but they had also left scars he seldom acknowledged. The cab pulled up to the entrance of a historic luxury hotel in Midtown Manhattan. As Martin stepped out, the doorman greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome, sir. Let me get that for you," he said, reaching for Martin's luggage. "Thank you," Martin replied, his tone polite but reserved. Inside the lobby, the marble floors gleamed under the grand chandelier, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the space. At the front desk, the receptionist checked him in with practiced efficiency, her eyes lighting up when she recognized his name. "Mr. Hayes, we're honored to have you as our guest," she said, handing him the keycard. "If there's anything you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to ask." Martin smiled faintly. "I appreciate that. Thank you." An unexpected encounter. After settling into his suite, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, Martin decided to take a walk. The cool evening air invigorated him, and he found himself drawn to a nearby park. He strolled along the pathways, observing the diversity of life around him. Joggers, families, street performers, and food vendors. New York was a city of contrasts, and Martin had always admired its ability to bring people from all walks of life together. As he paused to watch a saxophonist play a soulful tune near a fountain, a voice called out behind him, "Excuse me, sir, are you Martin Hayes?" Turning, Martin saw a man in his late 30s wearing a suit and tie. His expression was a mix of awe and nervousness. "I am," Martin said, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Kevin Daniels," the man said, shaking his hand enthusiastically. "I work for a firm that partnered with Hayes and Ellington on the Hudson Terminal project. I can't believe I'm meeting you here." Martin's eyebrows lifted slightly. The Hudson Terminal project, now that brings back memories. That was quite the undertaking. Kevin nodded eagerly. "It was. Your designs revolutionized the way we think about passenger flow and efficiency. Honestly, you were the reason I got into civil engineering. I've followed your career for years." Martin chuckled softly. "Well, that's kind of you to say. I've always believed that innovation should serve the people, not just the bottom line." The two men chatted for a while, discussing the challenges and triumphs of past projects. Kevin's admiration was evident, but what struck Martin most was his sincerity. It reminded Martin of his younger self, eager, idealistic, and determined to make a difference. Before parting ways, Kevin hesitated. "Mr. Hayes, if it's not too much trouble, would you consider speaking at a seminar my firm is hosting tomorrow? It's on the future of sustainable infrastructure. I think your insights would inspire so many of us." Martin paused, considering the request. He had come to New York to relax, not to work. But the earnestness in Kevin's voice was hard to ignore. "All right," Martin said finally. "Send me the details, and I'll see what I can do." Kevin's face lit up. "Thank you, sir. This means the world to me." The seminar, a stage for change. The next day, Martin arrived at the seminar, held in a sleek conference hall overlooking the East River. Engineers, architects, and industry leaders mingled, exchanging ideas and business cards. Kevin greeted Martin at the entrance, his excitement barely contained. "I can't thank you enough for coming," Kevin said. "Everyone's been buzzing about you since I announced you'd be speaking." Martin smiled modestly. "Let's hope I live up to the expectations." When it was time for him to take the stage, the room fell silent. Martin stood behind the podium, his presence commanding without effort. He began his speech not with technical jargon or data, but with a story. "When I started in this industry, I was told more times than I can count that I didn't belong," he said, his voice steady but resonant. "But every challenge I faced wasn't just an obstacle. It was an opportunity to prove that respect, innovation, and collaboration could achieve what skepticism couldn't. The audience hung on his every word. Martin spoke of his experiences, the lessons he had learned, and the importance of designing infrastructure that served not just efficiency but humanity. He emphasized sustainability, equity, and the need for leadership rooted in empathy. When he finished, the applause was deafening. People rose to their feet, their admiration evident. A call for action. After the seminar, a line of attendees formed to shake Martin's hand, each one eager to share how his words had resonated with them. Among them was a young woman named Elena, a recent graduate who had been struggling to find her place in the industry. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice quivering slightly, "I've been feeling so out of place, like I'll never measure up, but hearing you today, it's given me hope." Martin placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Remember, every great achievement starts with someone who refuses to give up. Keep going. You belong here." As he left the seminar, Martin felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey to New York had been intended as a personal retreat, but it had become something far greater. A chance to inspire the next generation and remind himself that his work, his voice, still mattered. Ripples of change. Martin Hayes returned to his hotel room that evening, the glow of the day's events still fresh in his mind. The seminar had not only reinvigorated his sense of purpose, but also reminded him that his work, though technically finished in retirement, still held the power to inspire and drive change. But as Martin knew from experience, words alone weren't enough. It was the actions they sparked that made a lasting impact. The following morning, as sunlight poured through the tall windows of his suite, Martin sat by the small writing desk, nursing a cup of tea. He had a habit of starting his day by jotting down reflections, a ritual that kept him grounded through decades of corporate life. Today, his thoughts centered on what had transpired over the past 2 days. The flight, the seminar, and the unexpected interactions that seemed to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Kevin Daniels, the young engineer who had invited Martin to the seminar. "Mr. Hayes, I hope I'm not intruding," Kevin said, holding a folder in his hands. "Not at all," Martin replied, gesturing for him to come in. "What brings you here?" Kevin sat down, his excitement barely contained. "After your speech yesterday, the feedback has been overwhelming. People were moved, not just by your ideas, but by your conviction. It sparked conversations about how we, as an industry, can rethink our priorities." Martin tilted his head, intrigued. Conversations are a good start. But what's next? Kevin hesitated, then opened the folder, revealing a proposal draft. "I've been working on a project, a community-driven infrastructure initiative. The idea is to involve residents in the planning and design process, ensuring the spaces we create truly serve their needs. It's ambitious, but after hearing you speak, I feel like it might actually be possible." Martin studied the document, his sharp eyes scanning the plans and notes. It was rough but promising. "You're onto something," he said after a moment. "But ambition needs direction. Have you thought about how you'll fund this? How you'll bring stakeholders to the table?" Kevin nodded. "That's where I was hoping you could guide me. Your experience, your connections, it could make all the difference." Martin leaned back, his mind already turning. He had spent decades navigating the complexities of bureaucracy and corporate partnerships. If this young man had the vision, Martin could help shape it into something actionable. "I'll help," Martin said finally. "But on one condition, you commit to seeing it through. This can't be another idea that gets lost in a boardroom." Kevin's face lit up with determination. "Absolutely. Whatever it takes." The momentum builds. Over the next week, Martin and Kevin worked tirelessly to refine the proposal. Martin shared insights from his years of experience. How to anticipate pushback, how to frame the project as a win for all parties, and how to maintain the integrity of the vision even under pressure. Word of their collaboration spread quickly. Kevin's firm offered resources to support the project, and other industry leaders, many of whom had attended Martin's seminar, expressed interest in being involved. What had started as a spark was now becoming a flame. During one of their late-night strategy sessions, Martin shared a story that Kevin found particularly poignant. "Years ago, when I was just starting, I proposed an idea to redesign an airport terminal," Martin began. "It was revolutionary at the time, focused on accessibility and user experience rather than just efficiency. Most of the board rejected it outright. They said it was too idealistic, too costly. But one person believed in it, and that made all the difference. That terminal is now a model for others worldwide." Kevin listened intently. "So what changed their minds?" "Persistence," Martin said simply, "and proving that the human element is worth investing in. People want to feel valued, whether they're employees, stakeholders, or the community. Show them the benefits, not just on paper but in real, tangible terms, and you'll win them over." A public unveiling. Within a month, the community-driven initiative had transformed from a concept into a fully developed proposal. Martin's involvement had drawn significant attention, and the project was scheduled for a public unveiling at a high-profile industry conference in New York. The day of the unveiling arrived, and the conference hall buzzed with anticipation. Engineers, city planners, and community leaders filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the stage, where Kevin would present the initiative. Martin stood in the wings, a reassuring presence that gave Kevin the confidence he needed. As Kevin began his presentation, he spoke with passion and clarity, detailing the project's goals: to create infrastructure that was not only functional but also inclusive and sustainable. He highlighted how the initiative would involve local communities at every stage, from planning to execution. "The future of our cities," Kevin said, his voice steady, "depends on building not just for people but with people." The audience erupted into applause. Kevin glanced toward the wings, where Martin nodded approvingly. When Martin joined Kevin on stage for the Q&A session, the questions came quickly. How would the project be funded? How would they address bureaucratic challenges? Would this model work in other cities? Together, Martin and Kevin answered each query with confidence, their partnership embodying the balance of experience and innovation. The impact widens. In the weeks that followed the unveiling, the project gained momentum. Media outlets picked up the story, praising the initiative as a groundbreaking approach to urban planning. Cities across the country expressed interest in adopting the model, and investors began reaching out. But the true impact was felt at the community level. Neighborhoods that had long been overlooked found themselves at the center of the conversation. Residents were invited to share their ideas and concerns, and for the first time, many felt their voices were being heard. Martin visited several of these communities, sitting in on meetings and listening to people's stories. At one such gathering, an elderly woman approached him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I've lived here for 40 years, and this is the first time someone's asked what we need. Thank you." Martin shook her hand, his heart full. "Thank you for sharing your voice. That's what makes all of this worthwhile." A legacy of leadership. As the project moved into its implementation phase, Martin began to step back, knowing it was in capable hands. Kevin and his team had grown into confident leaders, and the ripple effect of their work was undeniable. For Martin, the experience was a reminder that leadership wasn't about holding on to power, but about empowering others. He had spent a lifetime building infrastructure, but perhaps his greatest legacy was the foundation he had helped lay in the hearts and minds of those who would carry his vision forward. A legacy cemented. The crisp air of a New York autumn filled the open square where hundreds had gathered for the grand unveiling of the first completed project under the Community-Driven Infrastructure Initiative. Martin Hayes stood off to the side, dressed in a dark coat, watching as Kevin Daniels and his team prepared to address the crowd. The energy in the air was palpable, an anticipation not just for the project's completion, but for what it symbolized. The site was a once neglected neighborhood park that had been transformed into a thriving community hub. What had previously been cracked pavement and overgrown grass was now a vibrant space featuring modern playgrounds, shaded seating areas, walking trails, and a central pavilion for events. Everything had been designed with input from the local residents, ensuring it reflected their needs and aspirations. A reporter approached Martin, microphone in hand, her cameraman adjusting the angle to frame him perfectly. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her tone respectful but curious, "you've been credited as the guiding force behind this initiative. How does it feel to see it finally come to life?" Martin smiled modestly. "I can't take all the credit," he replied. "This is the result of collaboration, engineers, planners, and most importantly, the people of this community working together. It's proof that when we listen to each other and respect every voice, we can achieve something extraordinary." The reporter nodded, impressed. "What do you hope will come of this project in the long term?" "I hope it inspires others to rethink how we build," Martin said. "Infrastructure isn't just about efficiency or profitability. It's about creating spaces where people can thrive. If this project can spark that kind of thinking, then it's a success far beyond its physical boundaries, a celebration of unity." The ribbon-cutting ceremony began with speeches from city officials and community leaders, each one emphasizing the collaborative spirit that had made the project possible. Kevin Daniels, standing at the podium, looked confident and poised, a stark contrast to the nervous young man Martin had met just weeks earlier. "This project isn't just about bricks and mortar," Kevin said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about people. It's about showing that when we come together, engineers, residents, and leaders, we can create something that truly belongs to everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, and as Kevin stepped away from the podium, he turned to Martin and gestured for him to join him on stage. Martin hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. As he approached the microphone, the crowd quieted, their attention fixed on the man who had become the heart of this movement. "I've been in this industry for decades," Martin began, his voice steady but warm. "And if there's one lesson I've learned, it's that progress isn't measured by how much we build, but by how well we build it for the people it serves." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "Today, we've proven that when we prioritize respect, collaboration, and understanding, we can create something that's not just functional but meaningful. This park isn't just a space, it's a testament to what's possible when we work together." As Martin stepped back from the podium, the applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering not just for the park, but for the vision that had brought it to life. Ripples across the industry. The success of the project quickly became a model for other cities. News outlets covered the story extensively, highlighting its unique approach to community involvement. Urban planners and policymakers across the country began incorporating similar methods into their own projects, citing Martin Hayes and Kevin Daniels as pioneers of a new era in infrastructure design. Invitations poured in for Martin to speak at conferences and panels. While he accepted some, he declined many, preferring to remain in the background. His focus was on mentoring younger professionals like Kevin, ensuring the principles of respect and collaboration continued to spread. One of the most significant developments came when the federal government announced a grant program inspired by the initiative. Dubbed the Hayes Model Grant, it provided funding for community-driven infrastructure projects nationwide. The announcement was accompanied by a ceremony in Washington, D.C., where Martin was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, the award in his hands, Martin reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a young engineer fighting to be heard to a retired CEO whose impact extended far beyond his own career. A personal milestone. Back in New York, Martin received an unexpected visitor at his hotel. Samuel, the airline manager from the infamous flight that had started it all. The man looked nervous but determined, clutching a small package in his hands. "Mr. Hayes," Samuel began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I know it's been months since that flight, but I've been following your work since then. I came here to say thank you. for what you said that day and for what you've done since." Martin raised an eyebrow. "I appreciate that, Samuel. What brings you to New York?" Samuel handed Martin the package. "I've started volunteering with a nonprofit that works with underserved communities to improve public spaces. I wanted you to have this. It's a token of appreciation from the kids at the first park we renovated." Martin opened the package to find a framed photo of a group of children playing in a newly refurbished playground. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "Thank you for inspiring us." For the first time in years, Martin felt his composure waver. "This means more than you know," he said quietly. A quiet evening. Later that night, Martin sat in his hotel room, the framed photo on the table beside him. He sipped a cup of tea, watching the city lights twinkle outside his window. The journey he had embarked on, both literally and figuratively, had taken him to places he hadn't expected. What had begun as a tense flight had become a movement, a reminder that respect, resilience, and collaboration could transform not just spaces but lives. As he prepared for bed, Martin felt a sense of peace. His work would continue, not through him alone, but through the countless individuals he had inspired. The legacy he had built wasn't about buildings or accolades. It was about people. And that, he thought with a quiet smile, was the greatest achievement of all. The final chapter. Martin Hayes sat quietly in the corner of a bustling cafe, his notebook open and pen poised. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft murmur of conversation around him. Outside, New York streets buzzed with energy, the city alive with its characteristic hustle. Martin had always loved observing life in motion. It reminded him of the intricate systems he once designed, each piece moving in harmony to serve a greater purpose. The framed photo Samuel had given him sat beside his coffee cup, its image pulling his thoughts back to the moment when the park had been unveiled. The joy on the children's faces, the pride of the community, and the ripple effect of the project all lingered in his mind. Martin knew he had set something in motion that would outlast him, but there was one last thing he wanted to do before stepping away entirely. The last lecture. 3 weeks later, Martin stood in the grand lecture hall of his alma mater, surrounded by students, faculty, and colleagues. The room was packed, with some attendees standing along the walls. The university had invited him to deliver a keynote speech for their annual leadership symposium, and Martin had agreed, knowing it would likely be his final public address. He began with a story, as he often did. "When I boarded a flight to New York earlier this year, I didn't know it would change the trajectory of my retirement. I expected a quiet journey, but instead, I found myself in the middle of a moment that reminded me why I spent my life in this field." He paused, scanning the room. Leadership isn't about titles, power, or control. It's about the impact you leave on others, how you uplift them, listen to them, and empower them to achieve something greater than themselves. Martin spoke about the airline manager, the park project, and the importance of humility and respect in leadership. He shared his belief that no profession, no matter how technical or high stakes, should ever lose sight of the human element. As he concluded, he offered a challenge to the audience. "Wherever you go, whatever you do, remember this. Progress isn't just measured by what you build, but by who you bring along the way. Make room for others at the table. Their voices will make your work better, your journey richer, and your legacy stronger." The room erupted into applause, and as Martin stepped away from the podium, he felt a profound sense of closure. He had said all he needed to say. A quiet farewell. After the lecture, Martin returned to his hotel room, where he began packing his belongings for his flight home. He had no major plans upon returning, just a quiet life, tending to his garden and spending time with his grandchildren. For the first time in decades, he felt ready to let go of the reins and trust that the seeds he had planted would continue to grow without him. The next morning, as he boarded his flight, he smiled at the gate agent who handed him his boarding pass. "Have a great flight, Mr. Hayes," she said warmly. "Thank you," Martin replied. This time, There was no commotion, no scrutiny, just the quiet dignity he carried wherever he went. The legacy lives on. In the years that followed, the principles Martin championed became a cornerstone of the industry. The Hayes Model Grant continued to fund community-driven projects across the country, and Kevin Daniels rose to prominence as a leader in sustainable infrastructure, often crediting Martin for his guidance and mentorship. The park in New York became a symbol of what was possible when communities and professionals worked together. It inspired countless similar projects, transforming urban landscapes and improving lives. Martin, meanwhile, found joy in the simplicity of his days. He spent afternoons teaching his grandchildren to tend to the garden, evenings reading by the fire, and mornings taking long walks through his neighborhood. Occasionally, he would receive letters or emails from people whose lives had been touched by his work. Students, engineers, community leaders, all expressing gratitude for the lessons he had imparted. One evening, as Martin sat on his porch watching the sunset, his granddaughter climbed onto his lap, holding one of his old notebooks. "Grandpa, what's this?" she asked, flipping through the pages filled with sketches, calculations, and notes. "That," Martin said, smiling, "is the story of my work. But the best stories aren't written in notebooks. They're lived, and yours is just beginning." The child giggled, and Martin chuckled along with her. For him, life's greatest reward was knowing that the values he had upheld, respect, collaboration, and compassion, would continue to echo through future generations. And so, with his work complete and his legacy secure, Martin Hayes found peace in the quiet rhythms of life, content in the knowledge that he had made the world a little better, one step at a time.